So we are now at 11:11, and we are going to start the panel that's entitled Urban Studies, Spatial Meaning, Where We Do Our Work. And our panelists that are with us today are Dr. Zenzele Isoke, who's Associate Professor of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at University of Minnesota. Dr. Davin Phoenix, who's Assistant Professor of Political Science here at University of California, Irvine. I think, can we get the lights up, actually? And Research Librarian Pauline Manaka, Research Librarian of Social Sciences, also here at University of California, Irvine.
First, welcome back, and it's just a real privilege, I think, to be here in the presence of such brilliance and genius and, just amazing kind of labor. And so first, I just want to thank Dr. Tiffany Willoughby Herard and her team, her village, who have made this happen. Thank you. Is this on? Can you guys hear me? Is this on?
It's only on
For the camera? Can you guys hear me in the back? Because if not, okay, fine. And then I also, before I get started, I just want to turn your attention to the back of the program, where there's a dedication to Waukesha Wilson and her family and those who loved her and loved her still and love her still, who was killed while in police custody of the Los Angeles Detention Center on Easter Sunday, May 27th, 2016. Just important to remember those who have passed and remember those who have lost their lives as a result of state violence. We remember her and we wish her family well, and we hope that she rests in peace and also in power. And so I want to get started. I'll do my comments this way. First, I'll just talk a little bit about my own kind of biography, my intellectual history and trajectory. And then I'll go into kind of an overview of the types of questions that I'm asking and the types of approaches that I am kind of, or my methodological commitments, that's a better way to say it, that I am kind of pursuing right now. And then I'll give you a little sample of what that looks like. And so the presentation is meant to be not just me telling you what I do, but me showing you what Black feminism means to me in practice. And so, yeah, just to give you a little bit of overview. So first, I'll just start. I picked political science as an undergraduate completely arbitrarily. Me and my best friend, since elementary school, we both used to love to watch and debate politics and talk about race. We started this organization called Senior Women on our campus. So we were always thinking about racial injustice and gender injustice and inequities all the time throughout our childhood. And so when we decided to go to college together from Long Beach, California, we just said, oh, well, we like politics, so we should go ahead and do political science. And that's the way I kind of selected my so-called discipline. I went to college at Clark Atlanta University, where I majored in political science. And after completing my BS, I went down to Selma, Alabama for a year to work with Selma, with a civil rights activist and attorney, Rose Sanders, where she taught us, we did these kinds of youth leadership camps. And so I worked with her, and I worked with welfare-reliant moms in Selma, Alabama, Dallas County, and was doing a lot of organizing work. And while I was down there, I was familiarized with this enormous history of activism that had taken place in Alabama throughout the 1990s. And it was a history that we really didn't talk about. And it was primarily designed to challenge the phenomena of tracking in Alabama public schools. And so there was this huge kind of movement down there, and I was commissioned by Rose Sanders to, basically write a history of that particular movement. And so I started the process of collecting oral histories from Black women, and also a few Black men who are in there as well, right around the age of, 21, 22 years old when I finished. I moved after spending a year down there. I had to choose between going to teach in public school in St. Louis, Missouri, where I was born and where my extended family lived, and maybe going to, law school or graduate school, and I ultimately picked graduate school. Why did I pick graduate school? Because I felt like many of those folks who were at Clark, they were not doing their work, and they were not studying the way I wanted them to study, and they all were going to law school, so I'm different than them, this kind of exceptionalism, of course. And, I decided not to do St. Louis because of, the range of the types of violences that kind of persist today were also persistent there. And I ended up going to graduate school in political science and at the University of Michigan. And I want to say a little bit about this experience because it's important. One of the first things that you must decide, the first things that you must decide as a political scientist is what field are you in? Are you going to be an Americanist? Are you going to be an international comparativist? Or are you going to be a theory? So right then and there, you have this territorialization of knowledge that is inherently violent for a person who wants to study blackness, period, okay? And this form of territorialization closely mirrors nationalisms, right? Because first off, what it does is it kind of compartmentalizes black politics, particularly American black politics. It isolates it within the context of the US, and it disconnects it from the black diaspora, which was really kind of profound to me. So that was the first violence, and we can talk a little bit about gender, but I think that territorialization of knowledge making is one that really leaves political science not just on a plantation, but it really leaves it way back in history, and I think we have to figure out a way to kind of break out of that. And so a lot of my, I ended up leaving political science and moving into gender studies. It was a combination of kind of family. I was a mother by the end of my first year of graduate school, and it was an unexpected kind of event. But, I rolled with it, and I ended up at Rutgers. They were starting a new gender studies program, and I was, recruited into that program and was able to continue my graduate studies without, and to be in an environment where I could actually study Black women's political activism without the over-determining presence of plantation politics as it was reflected and practiced in political science. So I now am tenured in gender studies at University of Minnesota. I have strong affiliations, with, no, I have strong affiliations with, political science and also African American studies. But let me go through my presentation really quickly. So one of the things, these are some of the questions that I am primarily kind of interested in. And these are my questions now. How do Black femmes organize social memory through protest, performance, and collective art making within and across urban diasporas? I study Black women's social movements and protest politics in urban areas. And so I'm interested in how we do our protests and do our politics through performance. I'm also interested in how journeying and travel can facilitate the ethical production of knowledge about the disparate and converging modes of subjectivity that mediate the performance of Black femme politics in contemporary cities. And then finally, how can Black femme scholars analyze contemporary experience ethically and pragmatically while centering the aesthetic priorities of the soul? Meaning, as we do our work, it has to be ultimately fulfilling and nurturing to our own humanness. Because if it is not, then we are only blindly and dangerously reproducing kind of these modes of social death that are currently theorized. And the way I do that is by not isolating Black feminist or Black femme activism within the U.S., but I think about it throughout kind of in terms of multiple and converging diasporas. So not only the diaspora of the Middle Passage, but also these other kinds of migrations and movements of Black women globally, right? So, and I can talk about that. So over the past, actually this is about past 12 years, I've conducted these microethnographies. So my book was on Black women's protest politics and social movements in Newark. Newark, but I've also done these microethnographies in Harlem in a meditation group. I'm currently doing a ethnography of multimodal performance artists in the Twin Cities. I've done a project in Dubai, and also last summer, I conducted a project on Black Haitian women's NGOs and like the NGOs that Haitian women themselves built, not these large kind of multinational Red Cross exploitative institutions that are kind of caught up in this web of capitalist exploitation and debt making, but the ones that Haitian women built for themselves. So again, I'm looking at microethnographies. So part of what I'm inspired by is the work of Sylvia Winters. How many people know Sylvia Winters' work? Read her, study her, take the time. And she talks about this whole idea of a collective rewriting of knowledge. And so my engagements are these microethnographies, as I'm kind of framing them here, are collaborative and by invitation only. So it is only with and through shared intimacies that I'm able to forge connectivities and relationalities with women in different parts of the world. I use oral histories through unstructured interviews and also participant observation and community spaces that are collectively organized and facilitated by myself and other women who I work and organize with. Therefore, there's reciprocal exposure, vulnerability, and also commitment of energies, and the community as well benefits. And so one of the things that's kind of really important about my work is I think of myself as being disloyal to disciplinarity. I think that disciplinarity is nothing other than a reproduction of the violences of nationalism, as I kind of tried to frame out. As Dionne Brand, and I'm citing her through her interlocutor, Catherine McKittrick, says, "I don't need no fucking country." I say, I don't need no fucking discipline. And so that's kind of the way I'm approaching my second book project, if you want to talk about that. So, yeah. And also, I prioritizing this way of sitting with. So it's not necessarily interviewing, because the work that I did in Dubai, for instance, and even in Haiti, we didn't have like scripted questions. As a matter of fact, we didn't actually have a real project going. But because if a so-called researcher goes with an agenda, they've already determined what it is that they will produce to a certain extent. And so it's a lot of open-endedness, but a lot of it is sitting with. The same way you would sit under your aunties or your grandparents and listen to their stories and ask questions, and people will talk, people will share something, they'll say something they're not supposed to, and things will kind of go and unfold as they will. I'm kind of using this as kind of, this multi-directional querying with friends, emergent friends, families, members and coworkers. So it's completely undetermined, and I can't share it now because I haven't figured out how to ethically retell these stories, and I'll talk about that a little bit. Another thing is academic literatures and knowledges are secondary to what I'm calling indigenous ways of knowing and mapping histories of place in relation to Black history and struggle. In other words, we have to study our own epistemologies to know how to understand and interpret our own experiences. If we are borrowing from a particular discipline, we are bound to reproduce the exclusionary ways of knowing that these disciplines are founded upon, in my opinion. I also think about, and here I'm being kind of influenced by the work of Paul Gilroy, especially, as well as been studying Fred Moulton's work as well too. But we think about storytelling not as a process, but storytelling as a ritual. And I'm going to quote Paul Gilroy here. He says, "The simple content of the stories is dominated by the ritual act of storytelling itself." In other words, storytelling is a creative, intersubjective process that is inherently performative. And we think about the listen of storytelling, it first involves what? What happens? Listening. You need an audience. Responding. Listening more. Remembering. Revising. And then also retelling. So if we think about storytelling as a ritual, as opposed to as a discipline or just a simple practice, then we are able to kind of become attuned to the relationalities and the intimacies that are permitting the sharing and expression in those stories and the remembering that are inherent in those stories. So these are some of the things I look at. So my work, I kind of think about like Black, feminist undercommons. I'm just gonna just hijack Moulton's work. And I really like folks like Claudia Jones, Zora Neale Hurston, Audre Lorde, also Nina Simone. Study her and Assata Shakur as sources of epistemological and methodological frameworks through which to understand and interpret Black womanhood. Of course, Black women's tactical, I'm thinking about Black women as being inherently mobile subjects, not subjects who are stuck in place, but as inherently, through our migration stories, the way we travel and journey within and between locales, and also within and between ideologies as a mode of political resistance for Black women who were involved in Black freedom struggle. And the last thing I'll say, I think I'm out of time now, is that I'm also moving toward kind of non-linear understandings of space, place, and also time and writing in the retelling of these stories. So I don't imagine that, this book project called Unheard Voices at the Bottom of Empire will look anything like my first book, which was still, even though it was very much kind of against the grain of certain types of scholarly writing, it was still a form of scholarly writing. And so I'm actually experimenting a lot with poetics or poetic expression as a mode of writing in the tradition of Audre Lorde, but also I've really been studying the work of Edouard Glissant and Sylvia Winters, and also Hortense Spillers. There's this new book out called Spill by Alexis Pauline Gumbs. You have to read that. Okay, so I'm just going to end with I call this my scholarship happens on stolen time, and so this particular articulation of our project, I only do it on planes, and so it's I just do it on planes. So it's called a Black woman's flight poem, and it's been a few years in the making. So I'm just going to share that with you to get a sense of how this as a practice kind of looks and feels. And I'm not a poet by training. I'm a stunted writer, so I love poets and I like to ask them a lot. But I'll just go ahead and share with you. It's called Insurgent Questionings, a Black woman's flight poem. How might Black women chart their own critical reflections on the making and remaking of race, gender, culture, class, power? Can our oppositional reflections deliver us into untold spaces of Blackness that are as of yet unarticulated? Can we move past old resentments and fears of empty nationalisms and freely dream of Blackness? Can we decolonize through the writing of diasporic encounters? Move from the diaspora to the concrete relations of converging and overlapping diasporas? How do we map the erotics of our own self-making? Is it ethical to make sense of how Black women chart our own journeys through empire, tell of the relations we have had in and across urban sites? Can we make our encounters with racisms productive, generative, and recuperative? If so, what are we producing, generating, and recuperating? I'm almost done. Can we invent new writing strategies that invite intimacy and connection rather than exploitation, alienation, and violence? Can we avoid the practice of violence in our retellings? Can we share in the unknown with others we have yet to know and can ever only partly know? Can we tell of our melancholic crossings and our joyful ones too? Can we tell of the tiny and ephemeral practice of freedom that we steal from this world, even as we slave to debt? Today, slaves still. Can Black women tell of the other inside of us and the other in each other's lives? Can we tell stories through and in spite of the raciology of urban archipelagos? Can we tell stories of folks gendered, ungendered, transgendered, and who refuse gender as a sign of power? Black women, can we mobilize through our relationality, learning to comprehend and confront the imaginaries of empire with our own? And I'll end there.
I'm next. Amen. I feel like I could leave. My name is Davin Phoenix. I'm in the political science department here at UC Irvine, and I want to thank Tiffany for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. So I was invited to speak briefly about my work in local politics, urban studies, and it's interesting to kind of talk about this because I feel like I'm at a bit of a crossroads. A lot of what you said resonated with me. I got my PhD at the University of Michigan, and so go Blue. Louder, okay. There are, so I definitely see times in which my work and even my approach to answering these questions being compromised by the kind of slavish devotion to the disciplinary bounds, and finding my work being marginalized because it's caught in the middle, right? Wanting to speak with clarity and force about how blacks are relating to political actors and political institutions, and yet finding that the main gatekeepers aren't finding this work broad enough and applicable enough, and also finding that this work, in trying to reach these broad audiences, maybe isn't as meaningful and as forceful as it could and should be. And so I'm trying to challenge existing paradigms and ideas, but to what extent am I only kind of reinforcing, right, or reinforcing those mainstream narratives and working to further invisibilize or silence the narratives that are so critical to our communities, but narratives that don't necessarily translate to the existing kind of paradigms of research. Some of my work in local studies has intended to provide a nuanced understanding of how black residents relate to their black mayors. So building on work that stresses the empowerment thesis, that people view these black mayors, particularly these breakthrough black mayors from the late 60s through the 80s and early 90s, as cues of greater policy responsiveness, right? This isn't simply a matter of symbolic politics, but these people are coming from our community organizations. They come from the norms that we've cultivated as we've sought our own means of community redevelopment and kind of defining and redefining the space. And so when we get a chance to elect these individuals in office, we think they're going to be uniquely responsive to us in a way that previous regimes have not. So looking at some data from the 2000s, we're seeing some fluctuations in black participation under these different black mayoral contexts, with black mayors that immediately succeeded non-black mayors in office seeing a rise in black participation. But black mayors who either succeeded themselves black mayors or have just had very long entrenched regimes, we see a decrease in black participation. And individually and in collaboration with others, I try to acknowledge the ways in which these black residents are looking astutely and shrewdly at the political environment and saying, we have numerous means at our disposal of extracting responsiveness from the system. And those means don't always have to be related to electoral participation. There's many other ways in which we can engage both one another and elites, right, to advocate for our share of the resources of the city. And so I was happy with that account that doesn't simply say, oh, well, black participation is dependent on black elites, right, or dependent on these conventional mobilization mechanisms. But as I've tried to evolve that work, I'm more aware now of what it's not saying, more so than what it is saying. And just having conversations, not only with colleagues, particularly some of the colleagues here at UCI, but also conversations in the classroom. I'm challenged by my students. Some of whom are in this room. I think they got snacks, but they're not here right now. Saying, okay, you've got this understanding, okay, this is how the extant literature says blacks relate to elites, and this is how you're challenging that literature, but what does that tell me about what's going on in Ferguson? What does that tell me about what's going on in Flint? What does that tell me about some of these case studies you present in these urban politics or black politics courses? And I've had to reconcile with the ways in which the paradigm that I've been trained to not only view the political playing field, but also formulate my questions and formulate my methodology for answering these questions. It's incredibly limited. And so I have to, I think, speaking to this theme, distance myself from the bounds of discipline and get at the heart of these questions, right? And be willing to not only challenge myself, but challenge these gatekeepers who say, well, where's the survey data, right? Where's the regression coefficients, right? This is something that was kind of, I've been indoctrinated with. And so I'm at a phase, right, where I'm kind of trying to come out of that and recognize what work can I produce that speaks to these real challenges we're seeing at the local level, where you've got communities having these drastic challenges of defining who belongs in this space, who belongs in this community, right? So when I show my students the demographic change that took place in Ferguson, you look at census data of Ferguson in 2000, right? Very different than what it looks like in 2008. You've got, just like any suburb, right, a white suburban population, right? Very low levels of poverty. And just 8 to 10 years later, vast change, right? So now you've got this influx of people that have been moved out of the core city by gentrification and recolonization of those spaces, and now we're finding themselves in these suburban rings like Ferguson, devoid not only of the critical resources and infrastructure provided by the city, but also devoid of those social networks and community spaces and norms that gave them a sense of ownership in the direction of the city, ownership in the norms of the city. So you've got this new clientele base, Black, economically vulnerable, in the same leadership structure, right? Same city council, same mayor, of course, same police force, right? So how do we wrestle with these drastic patterns of migration that we're seeing going back and forth? When I look at Flint, one of the last things I saw before I made the trip from Michigan to California to start the job here, this was August 2014, and looking at local news, I saw numerous reports of people talking about, oh, there's water in Flint, and they'd have glasses of water out the tap, and it's disgusting water, and the residents are saying, we're not drinking that disgusting water. There's no way we're going to drink water from this polluted river. You've got these EPA officials and these elected officials saying, oh, the water's safe to drink. Mind you, none of them are drinking the water, right? But they're saying it's safe to drink, and I'm thinking, well, you know, that's not going to end well, right? And so when you see nationally the bombshell, oh, the water was just as unsafe as people said it was, and now you've got all these serious health issues that are going to be impacting people for generations, and you've got serious issues with people's homes now that the value has gone down to zero. When we have this kind of broad discourse about what happened, but mainstream actors, right, are ignoring the discourses, ignoring the mobilization, the organizing of these Black heads of household, particularly these Black women that were mobilizing from the very beginning and saying, no, this water is unsafe. You can track 14 months of people organizing on these city council steps and organizing and trying to get the cameras, and they were failed by a number of actors. And we need to understand how those actors worked in accordance to fail these people. This isn't a matter of, oh, everyone was caught off guard, right? And this was a quiescent group of people, right? These people refused to drink the water since they could, but even if you can't drink it, you still have to bathe in it and do your clothes in it, right? And so we say, you know, our conventional political understanding is when people mobilize, when they are visible, when they are organized, and when they are persistent, they get responsiveness. And that's not the case, right? Too often, the reality of Black politics is that it proves the lie of our existing paradigms, right? Because these people did organize, they did everything that you're supposed to do as an aggrieved body politic, and yet nothing happened, right? And so, okay, well, the EPA officials failed them. These bureaucratic agents that don't have the same mechanisms of accountability, right? This is a systemic failure, right? And of course, the elected officials show their lack of accountability, right? By even undemocratic, de-democratizing governance in Michigan, right? With these emergency managers, right? That have all the authority without the elected officials, right? But also the media. It's really interesting to look at how local media, particularly kind of MLive, which is taking the place of these kind of specific local outlets, right? Because in this age, you have media's kind of coming together and conglomerating and stuff because no one has cause for local reporting, right? When Flint officials shifted the water to the Flint River, kind of the main people that would hold them accountable, their editorial board said, we think this is a great idea and we're gonna, you know, save the money. And so it's this same media that throughout this 14-month period that now is framing this issue as, well, I know there's concerns, but the water is safe, the water is safe. They're never departing from their existing paradigm, which is this is going to be good for the city, right? And so who has the means to really provide the outlet for articulation and aggregation of preferences and really just getting grievances out there when you've got this syndicate of actors that are self-interested, and that self-interest is working to the detriment of these black populations. We're seeing this work on down the line, right? I had a number of students raise questions in my black politics class about Obama's recent trip to Flint, right? Drinking the water, right? This is really stunning contrast in visuals, right? Drinking the water. Where were the people that could have drank the water 14 months ago, right? When people are saying, if you think it's safe, drink it, right? So I'll wrap up by saying, I don't think that my prior approach to local politics has given me a means of answering those questions and providing a framework so that when I present this with my students, it's presented in a way that heightens their critical awareness of the stakes without necessarily disillusioning them and disempowering them. Because it's very difficult to provide the conventional lens of political science and then raise these case studies of Flint, Michigan, or Ferguson, or I take it back to the MOVE bombing in Osage Avenue in Philadelphia in 1985. And have this understanding of, okay, we've been told all our lives politics works like this. If you work hard enough, right? If you pull your pants up and stop littering and get the house, and if you mobilize and organize and don't just stay complicit, the system will work to your favor. And all I do is provide example after example. That's not the case, right? And so I need to, both I think for the benefit of my own work having a significance and for the benefit of being able to equip my students with something that they can take with them so they can be change agents going forward, right? I need to be mindful of the ways in which the paradigm that I've been indoctrinated with maybe does more harm than good. And I have to go outside and go above and beyond the survey analysis and the conventional rational choice theory and kind of really tap into the meaning making and those indigenous ways of mapping and knowledge that are there, right? And so I'm very enthused to be a part of these kinds of conversations because I think they're really meeting me where I'm at and allowing me to maybe course correct and really be forward on a trajectory that I think can actually tap into the knowledge that matters. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, I'm not a professor. I'm only a librarian, am I? When I saw the topic that I'm speaking under, because Tiffany, she tells me what to do and I say, yes, ma'am. I said to myself, what is this? However, I have something to tell you. Because when Tiffany was doing her first book, which we all know is on South Africa, right? She was constantly sending me things, and I probably was giving her wrong information or not giving her information. But that's when we made a really serious connection. But that was not the first connection that I'm bringing to you today of librarian and your research. Because every day in my space, you guys send students, some of them are writing topics that are to their heart about their struggles, and we're looking at them and saying, we don't have that, maybe. So I'm raising that question, and I'm going to tell you what my topic today is, because in my other life, I'm a political scientist. When I came to this country, I was a Fulbright scholar for librarianship in 1977. Long time. But I was a product of that June 76 group. And for the first time, Fulbright was actually told to start looking at Black students. So I was one of those. I got admitted at Michigan which is one of the high-class library school producers at Rutgers and at Atlanta University. But you know who I chose, right? I went to Atlanta because for so many reasons, I was a product of Black Power. I felt like I was a Black consciousness guru, whatever that was at that time. And my son is back there, he's probably looking at me saying, "Shut up, Mom." But at that time, I thought it was better to choose Georgia because I knew something. I knew music, Gladys Knight, Isaac Hayes, you name them. I knew a lot about Georgia than I knew about Michigan, and I thought I was gonna freeze at Michigan and in Rutgers. So I chose to go to Georgia. And while I was there, I finished. The program was awesome. I had this dean of library school who was this short, Dean Jones. I mean, she was so good. So I finished just like that, and I happened to also, I was encouraged to apply to their political science program. So as all of you know, with Fulbright, you study and you're expected to go back and give back. I chose not to go. I don't think my government was happy with me. But I stayed in Atlanta and I studied politics, and I was listening to all these discussions about the 4 areas of political science. If we didn't have professors like Shelby Lewis, I think I would have flunked out completely. So mentors matter for us as Black students and everyone who will keep those visions and those ideas going. So I have since been, I was a member of NCOPS for many years, National Conference of Black Political Scientists, and that kept me going. And in fact, through NCOPS, which met in Oakland, I think in 1987 or so, I chose to come to California because NCOPS met there, and for the first time after a long time, I saw mountains in California, because Georgia does, In Atlanta, I saw like vegetation that looked like South Africa. I said, I'm moving there. I drove. I was still working on a PhD in politics on South Africa, and it was looking at the comparison of Malcolm X and Steve Biko. I plan to continue that study. But I got stuck when one of the advisors kept talking to me about the ideology, and I was looking at it at a different point. But as you can see, the space is trying to combine the spaces of being a librarian on one side and being, because I had to do that to survive, and also trying to do politics. I said, I'm gonna put this on hold. Even if it doesn't come out as a PhD, it will come out somehow, I hope. But then I worked at Cal State Hayward, which now doesn't exist. And then I moved to Southern California to UCI, and that was a different landscape. But in some ways, it was, it brought in challenges that were very unique. But I am a social science librarian for anthropology, and I have found that department very nurturing. I was able to combine my beliefs. In fact, I think I taught a class on South Africa a couple of times. But I see 5 minutes. But anyway, I just want to ask you a question, and I'm going to throw what I wanted to ask Black women in this association is, what is the scholarship on transitional justice in terms of its transitional justice to in African countries. I think that's what I'm more interested. And does that scholarship involve any contributions by and about women, Black women? Okay, because the holdup, as we can see now in South Africa and its transition, some of the issues of transitional justice there are horrid. I can mention a few have to do with refugees and displaced people. Some really horrid stuff is happening there. International disputes, of course, and the illicit drug thing, stuff we kind of have gone about. But when you read about the testimonies of women during 1994, when we were going through when the TRC was reviewing, and before we wrote the beautiful Constitution with the Bill of Rights, I don't know, am I talking to myself? Okay. Because we have one of the best constitutions when it comes to women's rights and gender rights. And also, when you look at all of that, the literature that I came across talking about women's roles is how women were so good and nurturing to the people that had been hurt by apartheid and racism, and facilitating the collaboration and the talks. So those histories, those testimonies, that research, I'm curious about, and I'm gonna let you know what my question and what my commitment to the whole process of transitional politics in South Africa, in addition to looking at works like Tiffany's book. I'm really challenged as an African immigrant woman in my space as a librarian to continue this belief that South Africa is going to it's going to get to their human rights goals. And with the participation in the scholarship of a lot of people, and I'm willing to keep digging and saying this is what I'm interested in, we will reach that transitional justice in South Africa. And I invite you guys, challenge you guys, your students, to please, let's all work, because it's not just South Africa, actually. It's global. It's we have the issues in Somalia, we have the issues in Tanzania, quite a number of countries, but also global, as you know, race, sexism, those justices that in South Africa, we can raise our Bill of Rights and say, yeah, we believe in them. But truly, some things may still be the same. Thanks to Tiffany, thanks to Shelby, people who have continued to encourage me not to give up my librarianship over my politics, but I'm getting to a point where I will focus on research only. Thank you. And I want to embarrass my son and tell him to stand up, because he came to him. Come on, Secha.
Thanks for being here, Lisecha. It's really good to see you. Okay, so as you can see, there is a setup happening for our lunch. We're going to have a little bit of time to break. And Darlisa, I'm glad to see you here, because I think something that would be good to do right now, we've asked for a couple of group photos. So this might be a good time for all of us, like, leave your things here, and then we'll go out, and Darlisa will find a place for us, and we'll take a group photo, and we come back in. There'll be a beautiful lunch waiting for us. Please do not take too long going outside, just literally like about 5 minutes. My goodness, thank you. I'm already I'm 10 steps ahead and leaving behind. Let me have a Sankofa moment. So I was meant to actually thank this panel and ask for Q&A. Excuse me for that. Are there questions for this panel? Thank you, Mzilla Kazi.
Thank you for the panel. It was really excellent. Continues to be an excellent day. I have two questions. One for Professor Zenzele. You speak of your journey and travels of Black women in the diaspora and spaces for sharing your stories and creating a diasporic understanding of Black womanhood through these stories, through poetics, and through your projects. Do you have a vision on contemporary diasporic relationships for Black women as people, scholars, storytellers? I mean, we're obviously in a very diasporic space and community here, but in hearing your work and also hearing about the incorporation of the story, I'm thinking you as a poet, a scholar, a griot, you know, so do you have a vision for where we go moving forward, or as Black women working together across?
Sure. So one of the visions I'm really entertaining. So this I'm teaching a course this fall called the Black Feminist / Queer Poet. And I want to, for this class, my intention is for it to completely be written in unstructured prose. And so the responses will have to come through unstructured prose, and my communications with my students will have to also be that way. So I actually want to experiment, because I think that language itself, like the English language, in the way in which our grammatical structure, the way we have to structure sentences can be inherently oppressive for folks who either haven't mastered the sentence, the English sentence, and or have difficulties putting their ideas or compressing their ideas into this particular structure. So I'm actually interested in trying to figure out how to encourage, we call it kind of creative nonfiction. And I'm not an English literature person at all, so I really do mean I go wherever my brain leads me in terms of like thinking about knowledge. But how is it that we can begin to actually write theory without having to adopt all of the kinds of grammatical rules, order, and structure of the English language? So that's kind of one of the things I want to experiment with. And I want to recommend the book by Norbesi Phillips, who writes this thing Zong. And if you look at, she writes this collective poem called Zong, which is actually channeled. And if you look at, these other diasporic writings, you're actually able to get beyond the physical and into the metaphysical and access aspects of our, it's going to sound weird, but our soul that we typically leave to artists like musicians and jazz artists or hip hop or whoever. But we leave it there. But I think that it's our role as scholars to begin to experiment and move some of our scholarship in that direction. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Are there other questions? Thank you, Allison.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful panel. My question is also mostly for Professor Zenzele, but for the rest of the panel too. Since you raised the question of ethics in ethnographic research, in changing some of the methods and frameworks that, in terms of data collection, framing it with that phrase doesn't even seem at all fitting, but that's part of the symptom of the problem. You're talking about how to share when in social sciences, this sort of sharing of information is often surveillance or infiltration. How can that be switched on the other side, both in the methods and the frameworks of this kind of research, and talking and sitting with people specifically?
So first off, you're not holding data. Data are things. They're objects. We're not working with objects, we're working with people. And when we hear stories, particularly among the women who I work with, we're also holding their pain. So we have to learn, and I don't know, you have to learn how to hold that pain and ethically relate to that pain, and also be very conscious of the way in which you're also engaged in not only kind of, you're part of it, right? And you also take that with you. So like my work that I did in Newark, I was really kind of heartbroken behind it because I had to leave, and those were my people, those are my relationships, and I do that. And but you're left with guilt if you don't understand that so much of Blackness has to do with movement. voluntary, involuntary, extra voluntary, I don't know. But it's part of that migration and traveling is part of it. So that heartbreak is something that you have to learn how to contend with if you're going to do ethnographic kind of work, or if you're going to claim to be dealing with stories. So I just think you have to learn how to move away from that, because one of the things that, colonization teaches us is that we're not human. We're things, we're objects, we're flesh, we have to, and not only that, you count data, you count things, but if we think about this counting, that has relationships to slave and the counting of black bodies and female bodies. Read Catherine McKittrick's Mathematics, Black Life. She goes deep into that. But we have to move away from the counting, because the counting is nothing but a reinstantation of a particular type of modernism that has its roots in enslavement. So I would just I'm on the other part of that spectrum of knowledge production that they talk about, and I would just urge us not to count stories, because you're transfiguring emotions and spirit into objects, and that's what the reverse of what we should be doing, at least in disciplines that claim to be, interested in the social, or claim to be interested in the human. So, yeah.
So I have a question actually for what it means to do research as a librarian. And I'm really curious about hearing you say a little bit more about what it means to have your work be in the library and be training people, and just to have you say a little bit more about what that experience is like.
Well, I was going to say to her, I'll start by answering you that yesterday we all saw how Natalia, a librarian, is also a poet, and she was able to move into her field without any, I don't think it's that easy, but I think there is something to be said in moving beyond discipline barriers. And when you're dealing with research librarians, which every one of you has dealt with one, I imagine, you need a little more communication beyond the barriers of, I want her to give me a bibliography, or, that was just to answer that part. But I want to go back to the question you asked about ethnography research. Here at UCI, we have a population of Asian Americans or Asians that is very high. I had a young kid, I call them kids, I better stop. I had a student that came to the library that needed to do something about ballet history of African Americans. And she's obviously interested in ballet. She had a writing paper to do, but she knew nothing about African American history, and particularly about ballet. And she was totally frustrated because she was being pushed to the point where she didn't know if she could write this paper, and now she was really intimidated and totally. And having knowledge of research centers in Atlanta that have countless information of the period that she was looking for, and looking at one specific person that had actually founded a ballet organization and all that. So we were able, over periods of consultation and me sending things to her from librarians that I knew, African American librarians that I knew, to the point where now she wrote me again this quarter. She says, I chose to do a writing 139W class or something like that, and I'm doing this paper on Shakespeare. Shakespeare? And I shouldn't be laughing like that, right? And she was saying all of the literature we were using was in Old English. I did Old English when I was in my undergrad. And I was totally lost, and I really want you to help me again, Pauline. And I stepped back and I said, but you know what? Our profession is that we are expected to do referrals, knowledgeable referrals, So the English librarian here at UCI, I just emailed her, I connected them, and all that's settled. So what am I saying to this group is that your students have passions about their papers, especially the writing paper, but in general, they are driven by the same things that we want to see the next generation address of what's wrong with scholarship. And so librarianship is more than just Twitter, which, by the way, I have my issues with. But, it's other things. But our students are also very active in Twitter, so we try to embrace those spaces also. Facebook, we embrace them in ways that can give them how to be literate as scholars, how to do better research. However, I come in at the level where I say how to be yourself. And I had to learn from my own son who said, Mom, I'm not being that. I want to be a filmmaker. Of course, we fought. We are not agreeing, but we are at a point where I'm seeing where he's coming from. He's not going to have any money, I know it. But, he's my kid.
You don't know. You don't know.
Okay, yeah, but at any rate, so there's that level of generational differences as well as scholarship, our own training, but we also have a cultural responsibility to nurture and raise a future generation. And librarians believe that, and we do that in different ways. So your relationship with your librarians, and you are very famous in the library, ma'am, is something that we all have to respect. I hope I wasn't too...
So just being cognizant of the time, thank you very much to this panel. Thank you.